Welcome to the wide open spaces of southeastern Colorado. It's not every day that an outdoorsman like myself has the opportunity to spend time on a vast, isolated cattle ranch that has a rich history spanning thousands of years. Its canyons and plains were inhabited by the ancients, by the Arapaho, by the Kiowa, by Comanche, in more recent times the flags of Texas, France, Spain, Mexico, and the United States have waved over its wind-blown expanses. Around the turn of the 20th century, settlers moved in and inhabited the land. Over the years, agriculture has given way to cattle ranching. Now, cattle is king. It finally arrived, the first day of the hunt. Frank and I were up before daylight, and our first stop was the Windmill. Our objective for the day was elk. Wouldn't you know, our first sighting was a mule deer buck, just coming into the rut. With no elk in sight, we decided to relocate to a different part of the ranch. We glassed a high ridge very thoroughly and didn't see anything. On our way out, we made one more look, and the rump of an elk materialized. It wasn't long before nearly a dozen elk were out on the ridge. Too far off for a shot, we opted to come back later. Later that day, we left the ranch for the afternoon hunt. Along the way, Frank took me to an old abandoned homestead.
Packing boxes, doesn't it?
It does. They're old boxes, huh?
The bucket don't fall under there.
Yeah. Wow. So there's the stove.
Pretty fancy, huh? Look, here's how you shutter your windows.
You just put those
Take
across
this
it.
piece of wire.
Old stove. There's a water pipe. Goes down. There's a well in there. Oh, here's the corral. It's built up. It's got a little rock. It's got some wire, some barbed wire. Here's the cellar.
It must have been little, or maybe that was dug out more. But there's the door.
I'll be dang.
Look at the nails on that the roof beam.
Yeah.
They must have hung meat or something off them hooks.
You think so?
I think so.
You think they crawled back in here?
I don't know. It's probably deeper than it is now because it looks like it's filled up.
Yeah, it's probably filled in.
Yeah, I bet it was. I bet that door was 6 foot tall. Look at the hinges are still on it.
Yeah.
Because you couldn't hang no meat. Look at there's wire there too.
Yeah. Yeah, that looks like a big spring.
Or maybe it's the spring out of the old Model A.
Maybe.
The seat. Because look at the wide metal.
Yeah. What can you tell me about this? When is
It's 2-point.
the 2-point? When was that?
From 1920 on.
1920 on. Okay.
But it's small 2-point. Look at it's only a 10 gauge wire instead of a 12. So it's smaller stuff. Maybe he worked with sheep right here. Cut them off. Yeah, and that's a gate. But I don't know why he put rock there unless he was pushing critters against it to work them or something.
Look at this. Look at the view from the front porch. To finish out the afternoon, from the heights we spotted 4 elk, 2 standing on the top of a red stone cliff and 2 more feeding among the rocks in the cliff face. We made them out to be 2 cows and 2 spikes, but again, they were too far off for a good shot. By the end of the day, we'd seen 16 elk, 13 cows, and 3 bulls. We both agreed that we were off to a good start. Today was a day of exploration. I took time off from hunting to cruise the ranch. On our outing, we saw evidence of the ranch's antiquity. A mysterious cairn, a turn-of-the-century sheep corral, and an old abandoned homestead house built into a hillside. These red cliffs are of great interest to me. They are reputed to have ancient petroglyphs left by unknown inhabitants dating back hundreds, if not 1,000 years or more. Taking a look back at last year's hunt, a momentous one for Rachel, an accomplished hunter in her own right, when she bagged her first bull with the help of her brother Sam and Uncle Frank.
Right. Yeah, you got him perfect.
And then here's a man. This one's in the book. This one is 1876.
1876.
See the horse here?
Oh, there's a horse, yeah.
See the cavalry glove?
The cavalry glove, yes. The cliffs were used by the ancients, later by Plains Indians, and last by sheep herders. There were numerous small caves that must have been domiciles. Some of the caves had rock walls built at their bases, probably to keep critters out and sheep in. The cliff base was about a mile long. Rubble and tall, dry grass covered the ground. I walked very carefully and carried a sidearm just in case. Frank, Jesse, and I hunted today. We didn't see an elk, although we did smell them while peering over a cliff off of Christensen Road. Later, we made a run through the north side of the ranch. We saw a couple of deer on Rufus Pass. We didn't see any elk. It's amazing to me how you can see 16 one day and go out the next day and not see a thing. We tried elk calls, and that didn't work. What saved the day for us were the deer sightings. The bucks were in the rut, and they were moving. Hunting or not, it's still business as usual at the cattle ranch. Frank took the afternoon off to receive 45 pairs of new cows and calves. I went to search for an abandoned town site nearby. The town was not much more than a few small buildings in its day. The buildings were made of almost entirely of squared rock slabs piled one atop another and cemented. The purpose of the town was to be a water stop for the hoped-for railroad. The railroad bypassed the town several miles to the east. After the town died and was abandoned, the rock walls were hauled off by a local rancher. They are used to build his home and corral sometime around 1920. The ranch house is made from these very same rocks, the rocks that surround me almost 100 years later. Here, close to where the wagon ruts come together, is a definite habitation site. You can see the rocks have been placed here. Dotting the town site were dugout holes. They are often used by homesteaders as a primitive living structure until a more permanent one could be built, and later as a root cellar and a tornado shelter. It may have been a barn, it may have been a house. As you can see right here, as it goes out, the grass is such that possibly there were fences around there and there were animals in that. It might have been a corral at one time. You can see the rocks are piled up. I would assume this could have been a wall of some kind. or possibly a stone fence. You can see right in here. There's a nice straight line right there, and then it goes on up into there. This is again part of this area where I'm finding all the ruins. See, here's probably a large house here in Atlanta. Here's a cross brace here. We go over here. Here's a cross brace here. Here is a cross brace. This area right here, I believe, was an area where they split the rock to build the structures. This all this rock here basically looks like shards, and if you look closely, you can see that they aren't natural, that they have been cut, and these were probably pieces that they didn't need. In the 1860s, the U.S. Cavalry established a freight route. It was a cutoff of the Santa Fe Trail and was used to supply forts in New Mexico. The route was also used by the U.S. Cavalry during the Indian Wars. The route became obsolete when the Santa Fe Railway pushed southward into New Mexico. I would have to think this is the crossing right here, simply because it looks like it's been filled in. There's rock down there that was dumped, obviously, over the years. It's mudded up, but I think probably in its day it was very usable. And this is a view from the north side, looking east as it goes down the hill, cuts across the river, and then goes up the other side. The hunt started before daylight, as they all do here at the ranch. Frank and I were in the Jeep just as light began to illuminate the eastern sky. Our destination was the Elk Overlook, where we spotted the elk herd earlier. We moved along with purpose, but stopped frequently to glass for elk in the half light. At our destination, as the sun rose behind us, we thoroughly glassed the northwest pasture and its ridges, but found nothing. We lingered, hoping to catch a glimpse of elk activity in the valley, because we were certain the herd was close by. Nothing was stirring anywhere. Nothing. Frank decided to try a Hail Mary tactic to shake things up. He pulled a bull elk call out of his jacket, pursed his lips on the cold mouthpiece, and blew an amazingly authentic bull elk call. The call was high-pitched and echoed back off the surrounding ridges. It was surprisingly loud, and as if on cue, a bull elk returned the call far off to the north. The callback was unmistakable. We glanced at each other with raised eyebrows and bemused grins. The hunt was on. Frank called again after several minutes of chill time. The bull came right back. Frank led me down a gradual downgrade to the elk bugles. We hadn't gone far when Frank asked me if I could smell elk. I didn't, but he did. Frank cut loose with another bull call. We were greeted with a return call that reeked of anger and challenge. We were getting closer to the bull and could hear agitation in his bellow. Just then, Frank spotted an elk on a hillside looking directly at us. We stood still as a cow elk watched us attentively, and another cow showed herself near the first. Frank asked me if I wanted to take a shot at her. He ranged it and found the distance to be 340 yards. He told me it was a doable shot and well within the range of the Remington 300 Ultra Mag rifle and 14x scope that I was using. I was in turmoil. There stood my chance for an elk. I wondered if I shot whether I would miss my mark. This shot was out of my comfort zone. 200 yards was my max. I asked Frank if we could move down the hill for a closer shot. He agreed and we started down. By this time the elk was bugling unprovoked and it was moving toward us. Frank and I took a knee next to a cedar. We could hear the elk moving through the brush. I clicked off the rifle safety and raised the rifle to my shoulder. I watched the cedars in front of me. I caught a movement. The bull elk emerged from the cover of the cedar in a purposeful trot. His dark chest and neck filled my scope. Frank, kneeling behind me, chirped on the cow call. The bull stopped his rapid gait and stood still. I had the scope centered on his chest, and Frank said softly, "Shoot it." I didn't hesitate and gently squeezed the trigger. The bull lurched back and turned to its left and trotted out of view behind a cedar. I ejected the spent round and jacked a fresh round into the chamber. Frank and I waited a minute or two and then moved in the direction of the wounded elk. I heard Frank say, "It's down." I heard it drop. Words can hardly describe the rush of emotions a person has after culminating a hunt with such a grand prize as this. The success of this hunt, as much of a fairy tale as it might seem to me, is a direct result of Frank and Sherry's hard work and effective property management spanning over many, many years. It's no simple task to balance the needs of a working cattle ranch and also the needs of a self-sustaining native population. As I reflect, there wasn't a day I wasn't up before the sun. I viewed scores of breathtaking sunrises and sunsets. I felt the timeless expanse of open prairie and witnessed its blowing tumbleweeds, frost-covered buffalo grass, airborne dust storms, and stark desolate beauty. I spent many hours searching and discovering. I truly felt as if I was in the hands of God and a welcome guest in this stark wilderness. Every day I felt the presence of those who passed there before me. I felt very small, very lucky, and very alive. You know what they say, once you pull the trigger, the work begins. It took Frank and I a half a day to get the elk out of the woods, and another 3.5 days of heavy processing. Frank and Sherry graciously allowed us to take over their kitchen and their grinder and their vacuum sealer. The result? A freezer full of prime elk meat.